In 1128, the young Geoffrey of Anjou, son of Count Fulk V of Anjou, married the English princess Matilda. This marriage was intended to end the long-standing conflict between the Angevins and the Normans, whose hostilities had lasted for over a century. It was also meant to strengthen Matilda's position in the struggle for the English crown, as her father, King Henry I, considered her his heir following the death of his son. According to legend, Geoffrey wore a sprig of broom, Latin Plantagenista, in his hair, which earned him the nickname Plantagenet. He became the founder of a dynasty that ruled England for over 2 centuries, evolving from Frenchmen on the English throne into powerful English kings. At the time, it was still called the Angevin Dynasty, after the French county from which it originated. The name Plantagenet only became established in the 15th century, when the English were already at war with the French and sought to avoid associations with Anjou. Soon after, Count Fulk V of Anjou traveled to Jerusalem, where he became king, and his son became Count Geoffrey V. In 1135, after the death of Henry I, the English crown was seized by his nephew Stephen I. Geoffrey and Matilda began a struggle for the throne. In 1141, Matilda landed in England, and her forces captured Stephen I. Despite this, she never got to rule England. She quarreled with the barons. The citizens of London rose up against her, and Stephen, having escaped captivity, resumed the war. By the following year, Matilda narrowly avoided being captured in Oxford, and only the western part of England remained under her control. While on the continent, Geoffrey was victorious. On the island, Stephen prevailed. The war dragged on, with no decisive battles, frequent plundering, and barons constantly switching sides. Because of this, it would later be called the Anarchy. After the death of Geoffrey Plantagenet in 1151, the House of Anjou was led by his eldest son, Henry. Contemporary sources gave Henry 2 nicknames: Empress, meaning son of the Empress, and Kurtmantle, which refers to his short cloak. To strengthen his position in the ongoing war, Henry began seeking allies. The Duchy of Aquitaine was the richest region in France, and its rulers were effectively independent from the French kings. When William X died in 1137 without a male heir, the duchy was to pass to the husband of his daughter Eleanor. That husband became the French king Louis VII. Nevertheless, the marriage was unhappy. And worst of all for the king, Eleanor failed to give him an heir. So, in 1152, they divorced. Almost immediately afterward, Eleanor traveled to Poitiers and married Henry Plantagenet, who now inherited Aquitaine. After this, Henry repelled Louis VII's attacks and suppressed a rebellion by his younger brother. He then went to England, where he won over the local barons to his side. Stephen I, lacking the strength to continue the war, agreed to negotiations. Ultimately, according to the agreement, the crown remained in Stephen's hands, but upon his death, it would pass to Henry Plantagenet. In 1154, Stephen I died, and Henry II, the first king of the Plantagenet Dynasty, became the new King of England. His lands stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. The main dilemma was whether Henry was primarily the King of England with holdings in France, or a French vassal with a crown on the side. This became the foundation of the conflicts between England and France in the following centuries. In 1156, the French king supported Geoffrey Plantagenet when he raised a rebellion against his older brother for the second time. Once again, Geoffrey was defeated. Meanwhile, Henry intervened in the conflict that had broken out in Brittany and succeeded in installing his own nominee, Conan IV, as Duke. In 1159, he launched a campaign against Toulouse in an attempt to annex these lands from the then Count. This campaign turned out to be unsuccessful, as Louis VII arrived in Toulouse just in time, and the English king had to resort to negotiations. In 1166, Henry II invaded Brittany, where the barons had rebelled against Conan IV. After suppressing the rebellion, Henry also forced the Duke to renounce his title and handed Brittany over to his younger son, Geoffrey. In addition to wars, Henry also carried out a number of reforms, most of which took place in England. In 1166, he issued the Assize of Clarendon, which legalized jury trials. Such courts had existed in England before, but it was under Henry II that they became the kingdom's primary form of justice. He also introduced the practice of collecting scutage, a monetary payment in place of military service. On one hand, this provided funds to hire mercenaries. On the other, it reduced the king's reliance on unreliable feudal lords for troops. One of the most famous episodes of Henry II's reign was his conflict with Thomas Becket. Becket had been the king's chancellor and close friend. Hoping to strengthen his influence over the church, Henry secured Becket's appointment as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. Nevertheless, once in office, Becket began to staunchly defend the interests of the church and soon found himself in conflict with the king. Eventually, in 1170, during a banquet, the king hinted that it would be good if someone killed the archbishop. 4 knights, interpreting this as a command, murdered Becket. The dramatic conflict dealt a serious blow to the king's authority. Henry II quickly departed for Ireland, where English forces had just conquered part of the island. After spending half a year there and receiving oaths of allegiance from both English lords and Irish kings, Henry returned to Normandy. To ensure the succession, Henry had his son crowned as co-ruler. This practice was common in Europe at the time, as it prevented vassals from opposing the new heir after the old king's death, since they had already acknowledged him as their sovereign. Thus, in 1170, Henry II's son, also named Henry, was crowned. To distinguish him from his father, subjects referred to him as the young king. And there was no guarantee that the young king wouldn't rise against his father, which is exactly what happened. And in 1173, the younger Henry raised a rebellion against his father, supported by his brothers and his mother, Eleanor. The uprising was joined by Norman barons, as well as the kings of France and Scotland. Then, Henry Plantagenet took action. First, he reconciled with the church, gathered an army of mercenaries, and crushed the rebellion on the continent. Meanwhile, on the island, his other forces defeated the rebel barons and repelled the Scottish invasion, capturing their king. And when the French laid siege to Rouen, Henry went to Normandy and defeated them beneath the city walls. After that, he even forced the Count of Toulouse to swear fealty to him. It became clear that the rebellion had failed, and Henry the young king reconciled with his father. In 1183, he rose in rebellion once again, was defeated, and died of dysentery. After the death of his eldest son, Henry II decided to redistribute his lands among his sons. He intended to give England and Normandy to Richard as his heir, and Aquitaine, which had previously belonged to Richard, to John. Richard opposed this decision and also rose in rebellion. Unlike his older brother, he was a more talented military leader, so Henry had to send his wife to negotiate with their son. She succeeded in reconciling father and son. Peace did not last long. Soon, Richard secured the support of the new French king, Philip II, and in 1189 he once again rose in rebellion. After defeating his father's forces at the Battle of Balance and besieging him at Chinon, Richard forced Henry into negotiations. The king agreed to Richard's coronation. On the other hand, when Henry learned that even his youngest son John had supported the rebellion, he died. The next king was Richard I the Lionheart, brave, strong, and skilled in leadership and battle. During his reign, the royal coat of arms featuring 3 lions appeared. According to legend, the lions represented the 3 most important Plantagenet lands: the Kingdom of England, the Duchy of Normandy, and the Duchy of Aquitaine. Shortly after his coronation, Richard I, known as the Lionheart, set off on the Third Crusade. one of the most significant military campaigns of the time. The crusade required enormous financial resources, which severely drained the royal treasury. There is a well-known legend illustrating his prioritization of the crusade over state matters. It is said that Richard remarked that he would be willing to sell even London if a sufficiently wealthy buyer came along. After crossing France, Richard did not wait for his fleet in Marseille and instead headed for Italy. It was only in Sicily that he finally met up with his army. There, he started a war with the Sicilian king over a conflict concerning the inheritance of his sister Joan. Later, Richard I also conquered Cyprus, which he then handed over to the former king of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan. In Palestine, the Third Crusade was a difficult campaign. The Crusaders were able to capture several coastal cities, but Saladin waged a guerrilla war, avoiding major battles. Richard faced Saladin twice in battle, where he once again demonstrated his skills as a commander. Nonetheless, during this time, Richard's greatest problems did not come from the Muslim Sultan, with whom chroniclers even attribute a form of friendship. Instead, the real challenges for the English king came from his allies. Immediately after the capture of Acre, Richard quarreled with Duke Leopold V of Austria. At the same time, King Philip II of France sailed back home. While Richard remained in Palestine, Philip launched an invasion of Normandy. Additionally, Philip began financing Prince John to help him seize the English throne. Upon learning this, Richard quickly negotiated a truce with Saladin and set off for home. On his way back, the king was captured by Leopold V, who handed him over to Emperor Henry VI in exchange for a portion of the future ransom. The emperor valued Richard at 150,000 marks in silver, which was equivalent to 3 years of the English royal treasury's income. While Eleanor gathered the money for her son's ransom, Prince John paid the emperor to delay negotiations and keep Richard in captivity longer. It wasn't until 1194 that Richard was freed. He gathered an army in England and, near Nottingham Castle, defeated John's supporters. Afterward, he went to Normandy, where his brother was the first to seek peace. Richard forgave his brother, saying that John was merely a child with bad advisors. He then began a war with Philip II. After defeating the French at the Battle of Freteval, the English king began reclaiming the lost castles. In 1198, when Philip tried to attack Richard again, the English king inflicted another defeat on him at the Battle of Gisors. The following year, Richard went south to fight rebellious barons. During the siege of Château de Châlus-Chabrol, the English king was mortally wounded by a crossbow bolt. Thus, the King of England became John I. Even as a child, he was nicknamed Lackland because his father did not allocate any lands to him for a long time. This nickname turned out to be prophetic. In 1176, his father, Henry II, proclaimed 10-year-old John as the king of the recently conquered Ireland. John first visited his kingdom only in 1185, where he immediately quarreled with the Irish kings, who were supposed to swear allegiance to him. This led to a rebellion of the Irish, and John had to flee from the island. At the age of 33, after the death of his 3 older brothers, John inherited the English throne. The new king immediately began searching for a new queen. His choice fell on Isabella of Angoulême, the daughter of the Count of Angoulême, who was already engaged to Count Guy de Lusignan of La Marche at the time. To marry Isabella, John had to resort to kidnapping her, which was a personal insult to Guy de Lusignan and led to his rebellion in 1202. The rebellion was supported by Philip II and John's nephew, Duke Arthur of Brittany, who swore allegiance to the French king. In the Battle of Mirebeau, John defeated the rebels, but instead of strengthening his position, he proceeded to plunder Brittany. This gave Philip II an opportunity to quickly seize Normandy, and he also convinced the barons of Anjou and neighboring counties to submit to the authority of the French crown. Upon returning to England, John raised taxes to cover military expenses. This caused discontent among the barons. Soon, John's campaigns against Scotland, Ireland, and Wales seemed to enhance the king's authority. Finally, in 1213, John assembled a new army to wage war against France. He also formed an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor and rebellious French nobles to act jointly against Philip II. At the beginning of 1214, John landed in France. Initially, he planned to march on Paris, but instead he focused on conquering Anjou. Then, the French king defeated John's allies at the Battle of Bouvines. The English king lost the war without losing a battle. This defeat forced him not only to abandon further claims to the previously lost territories, but also to give up a significant part of Aquitaine. This led to open conflict with the English barons. They forced John to sign the Magna Carta, a document that limited royal power. But John failed to honor his commitments. The First Barons' War began. The king gathered an army of mercenaries and set out to punish the opposition. In 1216, John fell ill with dysentery and died. The crown passed to his 9-year-old son, Henry III. Meanwhile, some of the barons supported the French Prince Louis. England stood on the brink of collapse, and the Plantagenet Dynasty was one step away from falling. The dynasty was saved by the talented commander and royal regent William Marshal. At the Battle of Lincoln, he crushed the rebellious barons, and in the naval battles at Dover, the English fleet defeated the French reinforcements. Prince Louis was forced to leave England. Like his father, Henry III lacked military talent. He made 3 attempts to reclaim the ancestral Plantagenet lands in France, but failed in each campaign. The greatest disaster for the English came at the Battle of Taillebourg, where they suffered a crushing defeat, and the king escaped only by fleeing. The wars with the French exhausted the royal treasury. The only achievement was the retention of a part of English holdings in southern France, now called the Duchy of Guienne. In 1259, Henry appointed his son Edward as its ruler. In politics, Henry also did not excel. He often quarreled with his barons and was surrounded by unpopular advisors. He frequently made controversial decisions. For example, in 1254, he decided to launch a campaign to Sicily, a goal too distant and unattainable. The English barons refused to support this idea. Serious conflict arose with the Earl of Leicester, Simon de Montfort. Initially an ally of the king, but later the leader of the baronial opposition. In 1258, he initiated a gathering in Oxford with the participation of barons, townspeople, and representatives of the counties. This Oxford Parliament, also known as the Mad Parliament, nearly triggered a civil war. Eventually, Henry agreed to a series of documents that limited his power. These assemblies became annual and took the name Parliament. Like his father, Henry III had no intention of keeping his promises. In 1263, the Second Barons' War broke out. Simon de Montfort captured the king and effectively took over power. But the next year, Prince Edward launched a counteroffensive. The king tried to resist, but was captured again at the Battle of Lewes. Eventually, Edward defeated the barons at the Battle of Evesham, restoring his father's authority. This time, Henry III began cooperating with Parliament, which allowed him to rule peacefully until his death in 1272. Edward I, Henry's son, earned the nickname Longshanks due to his tall stature. Shortly before his father's death, he embarked on the 8th Crusade, returning to claim the crown only in 1274. Unlike his father, Edward I did not quarrel with the barons and was skilled at finding compromises. Thanks to this, Parliament, once an opponent of royal power, became its support. After losing most of their lands in France, the Plantagenet dynasty increasingly tied itself to England. Edward himself bore an English name, spoke English fluently, and embraced local culture. During his reign, the English nobility began to assimilate as well. Feudal lords gradually abandoned French traditions and became English. For this reason, Edward I is sometimes called the first true English king. Nevertheless, Edward Longshank's greatest fame came from his conquests. Wales, fragmented into many small kingdoms, had long resisted English incursions using effective guerrilla tactics. Much earlier, following the Norman conquest of England, William the Conqueror had initiated the creation of the Welsh March, a special border zone with extensive powers for English lords. This march gradually expanded its influence, absorbing Welsh lands through military incursions and castle building. In response, the Welsh kingdoms began consolidating under the leadership of the Kingdom of Gwynedd. In 1282, a civil war broke out in Gwynedd, prompting Edward to intervene. By 1283, England had conquered all of Wales. To secure control, the king made a deal with the local nobility, promising that Wales would be ruled by someone born there who did not speak English. Thus, Edward declared his newborn son, born in Carnarvon Castle, Prince of Wales. Formally, Wales remained independent, but in reality it came under English rule. The Welsh nobility joined the English elite, and the English adopted the Welsh longbow, a symbol of English archery that brought many victories to English kings. Since then, the title Prince of Wales has become traditional for the heir to the English throne. After subjugating Wales, Edward turned his attention to Scotland. In 1286, the Plantagenet Dynasty came to an end, and the Scottish nobility could not agree on a new monarch. To avoid civil war, the Scots turned to the English king as an arbitrator. Edward I brought troops and supported John Balliol, whom he considered his vassal and ally. Soon, John rebelled against the English, and Edward Longshanks invaded Scotland again, defeating the Scots at the Battle of Dunbar. In response, the Scots rose in rebellion under William Wallace. Edward crushed this uprising as well. It seemed Scotland was finally subdued, but the more the English controlled Scotland, the more Scots rose up against them. Eventually, Robert the Bruce, formerly Edward's appointee in Scotland, rebelled. War flared up again, but Edward I would not live to see its conclusion. In 1307, on his way north, he died. The new king, Edward II, did not inherit either the military prowess or the statesmanship of his father. In 1314, despite having an army twice as large, he suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn and permanently lost control over Scotland. In domestic policy, Edward II also failed. He often clashed with the nobles due to his favorites, two of whom stood out in particular. The first was Piers Gaveston, whom contemporaries accused of having inappropriate relations with the king. The second was Hugh Despenser, whose influence led to a baronial rebellion in the north in 1321, demanding the removal of the Despenser family from power. Even so, Edward managed to suppress the uprising and temporarily regained control of the situation. When Edward II lost the war to the French, even his closest allies turned against him. The conspiracy was led by his wife, Isabella of France. To secure soldiers, Isabella arranged the marriage of her son to the daughter of the Count of Hainaut, who in exchange provided his troops. This marriage between Edward and Philippa became one of the examples of a happy union in feudal times. They lived without conflict and had 9 children. Whenever Edward went off to war, he entrusted the governance of the kingdom to his wife. In 1326, Isabella's lover, Roger Mortimer, gathered an army in Flanders and invaded England. The king fled to Wales, but was captured there. Edward II soon died. Most historians believe he was murdered on Mortimer's orders. His son, Edward III, was proclaimed the new King of England. Crowned in 1327, the young king had no real power. The kingdom was ruled by his mother and her lover, who became the Earl of the Welsh Marches. At the same time, taking advantage of England's internal crisis, the Scots invaded the north of the kingdom. Roger Mortimer led a campaign against them, but failed to defeat the Scots. When he surrounded them near Stanhope, the Scots broke through the encirclement. This defeat seriously damaged Mortimer's reputation, and in 1330, Edward staged a coup, imprisoned him, and had him executed. Edward III also attempted to conquer Scotland. These events are known in history as the Second War of Scottish Independence. The English won several battles and occupied Scotland. The Scottish king, David II, fled to France. Even so, the Scots again mounted fierce resistance. While Edward III was preparing for war with France, the Scots gradually regained their lost territories. Subsequently, the war with Scotland became a lesser priority for England, overshadowed by the conflict with France. The English repelled a Scottish invasion at the Battle of Neville's Cross, captured King David II, and demanded a ransom of £60,000 sterling. The only territorial gain in this war was the Isle of Man, which the Scots were unable to reclaim due to their weak navy. Yet Edward III gained the greatest fame from the 100 Years' War with France. It began after the end of the Capetian dynasty, when the English king laid claim to the French throne as the grandson of the king through the female line. But the French nobility rejected his claim, citing the Salic law, a legal code from the 5th century that forbade succession through women. Soon, the new French king, Philip VI of the Valois dynasty, attempted to seize Guyenne, triggering the 100 Years' War. Here, Edward III proved himself a talented commander, and the English army earned a reputation as a disciplined force. It was composed mainly of professional mercenaries, with English longbowmen giving the English a decisive advantage in many battles. In 1346, the English achieved a major victory at the Battle of Crécy, and in 1356 they captured the French king John II the Good at the Battle of Poitiers. Despite military successes, the war ultimately deepened the divide between the English and French nobility. To the English, Edward III was a glorious king. To the French, he was a foreigner and an invader. French resistance grew, and by the time of Edward III's death in 1377, most of the lost territories had been reclaimed by France. Edward III had 5 sons, all of whom he made dukes. His heir was to be Edward the Black Prince, famed for his victories in the 100 Years' War. But he died a year before his father. Therefore, the crown passed to his son, Edward III's grandson, Richard II. At the same time, the new king's uncles founded cadet branches of the Plantagenet Dynasty. The most powerful of these were the Lancasters. Their representative, Henry Bolingbroke, took the crown from Richard II and became King Henry IV. His son, Henry V, won a great victory at the Battle of Agincourt and effectively conquered half of France, reigniting the 100 Years' War with renewed strength. Opposing the powerful Lancasters were the House of York. The conflict began with political intrigue, but after the English lost the 100 Years' War, it escalated into a prolonged civil war known in history as the Wars of the Roses. In this war, Plantagenets fought against Plantagenets. Both royal branches essentially destroyed one another. Historians often refer to the 15th century in England as the period of bastard feudalism. During these years, knights no longer played a significant role on the battlefield. They were replaced by mercenaries, who were often illegitimate sons of nobles, hence the term. This shift also changed the nature of politics. Feudalism evolved. High titles were no longer as important. A mere knight could wield more influence than a duke if he was close to the king, while the duke remained in the provinces. For example, the powerful Stafford dynasty, Dukes of Buckingham, despite their blood ties to the Plantagenets, did not claim the throne and were perceived as provincial nobility. The English crown, which had passed back and forth between the Yorks and Lancasters during the Wars of the Roses, ultimately ended up in the hands of the Tudor dynasty. The Tudors, of Welsh origin and only distantly related to the Plantagenets, gained power thanks to their influence at court and support from the victors. Thus ended the history of the Plantagenet dynasty, which for 2 centuries had shaped the English state, transforming England from a peripheral kingdom into one of Europe's leading powers.